about here is editing and formatting your text. So you can see that we've have changes to Myriad Pro 12 on 16. Couple of things that you might want to do, and a lot of your options are available in the control panel here. But there's also, if you go under the window menu, go to type in tables. There's a character panel that gives you a few more options. And if you go window, type in tables, there's also a paragraph panel, which also gives you a few more options. If you wish, you can click on them and move them over here. And when you see that blue line, it docks them with the other panels that are there so that you have access to them. Let's take a look at the character panel first. This is also available on the control strip. Okay, a couple of things that you might want to do with this heading here, and this is especially important with display type, is to change the kerning. So the first thing I usually recommend you do is go to the kerning, which is this setting in the character panel, and change it to optical. What this has to do with is the fact that due to the shape of the letters, sometimes the spacing doesn't look even in type. I'm going to hit Command plus to zoom in a little bit here so you can see this better. Now, unfortunately for this demo, this typeface actually looks pretty good, but we will just pretend that we want to change the space here. So if you want to change the space between two individual characters, just place your cursor there and then go to the kerning in the character panel, and you can click on the down pointing arrow to move things closer together, or on the up pointing arrow to move them further apart. And it's entirely visual. Sometimes you need to reduce the space a little, sometimes you need to add some space. The other function in here, by the way, is called tracking. And if I highlight the entire piece of text and then go to the tracking, it actually moves everything. It changes the letter space and the word space. So you can do that. Some typefaces actually need a little bit more tracking. In this case, this one is actually pretty good. Okay, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Command minus to zoom out. And I'm going to put my cursor in this paragraph text as body text here, and again I'm going to hit Command A, edit, select all, and we'll look at a few things that we can do with our paragraph panel. Now you can always change the alignment here. You probably don't want it centered, you probably don't want it flush right. Flush left is actually pretty normal, as is justified, and these three justified options just tell Illustrator tell InDesign what to do with the last line of each thing. If you click on force justify, you get weird things happening, so I would recommend that you don't do that for most of what you're doing with type. One other thing, and I'm just going to leave it here for a minute. I'll zoom out just a bit more. If you choose to use justified type, make sure that your line length is not too long, because InDesign is trying to calculate the line endings and to try to keep the type color here, as they call it, make sure that there aren't big gaps between words. First off, watch what happens if I reduce the line length. You can see with really short line lengths and justified type, because of the size of the words, InDesign really has a lot of problems making the type even. You get what's happening here is called a river, where you have lines of gaps going down the column of type, and you have big gaps here. So if you really want to use justified type, make sure your line length is long enough. Another thing about line length actually is that it's really important to make sure that your lines are not too long. The ideal line length is somewhere between 50 and 75 characters in a line. Any more than that and your eye gets lost. I'm going to go over to the end here. You can go all the way to the and your eye gets lost on this end before it goes and has trouble finding the beginning of the line again. If the line length is too short, you may get big gaps. If you want to find out how long your lines are, you can count the characters one by one. Such an easier way to do it if you go under the window menu and go down to Info. Brings up this little Info panel. So I put my cursor in here with the text tool. You can see it tells me how many characters, words, and so forth are in my block of type. If I click on it and select one line, it actually tells me that there are 66 characters in this line, which is actually pretty close to ideal. If it were over 90, then you would know that your lines are too long. So the info panel gives you some useful information. Okay, the last thing I want to mention here, and I'm going to select all again, is what do you do at the beginning of paragraphs to let your viewer know that there's a paragraph there? And the two common ways are, number one, a first line indent, which in this case you would not put on the first paragraph. The first paragraph is never indented because we know it's the first paragraph, so it doesn't need to be. So I'm going to select the second paragraph and go down to this setting on the paragraph panel. And you can see what it's doing is it's moving the first line over. The general rule of thumb is somewhere around either the leading, so maybe somewhere between 12 and 16 points here. And you can see if I go here and hit return and make another paragraph, you can see both of those lines are indented now, so we know where the paragraph starts. The other way to do it, I'm going to select all of this and change the first line indent back to 0. The other way to do it is by adding space before or space after. And for this application, it doesn't really matter which you choose. I'll use space after here. And basically, you can see what's happening is when I add space, it's moving the lines apart. If I move them 16 points apart, it's the equivalent of having a full line return. So that also shows you where your paragraph begins and ends. The last thing I want to quickly mention here is hyphenation. Do you want to have hyphenation on or not? I'll select all again. If I uncheck hyphenate, you can see the spacing changes a little bit. And the reason is if hyphenation is on, InDesign has more options as to how to change the line endings. You can control the hyphenation to a certain extent if you want to use hyphenation by going to the little flyout menu to the side of the paragraph panel and clicking on hyphenation. If you want to use hyphenation, there are a few things I probably would change here. Hyphen limit, I'd probably make it 2. So you have 2 hyphens in a row. I would probably not hyphenate capitalized words because they tend to be people's names or possibly place names, and they're usually not hyphenated. You probably don't want to hyphenate the last word, so you can have a little tiny bit of a word at the end of a line. And hyphenating across columns, we don't have columns here, but if you're hyphenating across columns, that is also a bad thing. So by all means use hyphenation, but you can change the options in the paragraph panel. Okay, so I've changed my type. I've made it a little bit bigger. I've added more space in between. And I've noticed now that I'm missing some words, which I probably wouldn't notice because it's all Latin. But here's something to keep in mind. If you see this little red square at the bottom of your text frame, That actually means that there is some text that's cut off. It's called overset text. Clicking my selection tool on it gives me a loaded text tool here. And I can actually create another text frame that text will flow into. So you can see if I went here and hit return, you can see the text is going from one to another. So these two text frames are now linked. If you want to create a third text frame that's linked, I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller here. You can either click on the overset text. It's called the output, or if you create a new text frame somewhere else on another page, for example, and then you realize you need to link them. To link text frames, it's basically the same process. Click on one of the selection tools, either one will work. Click on the little red output there. Click on the new text frame. And they will be linked. Oops. So now these text frames are linked. If you want to see which text frames are linked, if you go under the View menu, Extras, Show Text Threads, and that shows you, these little arrows show you where the text is going. Probably want to turn that off when you're not using it. If you want to unlink this, actually all you have to do is delete the frame. Basically the text will not go away when you delete the frame. It goes back into the original frame and you get the overset text indicator again.